Ranking expansions is harder than I thought. First of all, when you add more things to a game I love, I'm automatically going to be thrilled with it, and it's going to get a high ranking. And I mean, when I started off gaming, I guess back in about 2003 or 17, 18 years ago, when I got back into the hobby, I would pretty much buy every single expansion that came out for a game that I owned, because I figured, hey, if it's a game I enjoy enough to keep, then adding more to it can only be great, right? But then Carcassonne came along and cured me of any completist tendencies I might have had. I eventually realized, it is possible to take a good game and ruin it by adding too many things to it. So thankfully I got over that whole thing fairly early on in my gaming evolution. But the point still stands. How do I rank things that I enjoy a lot? Do I go by my feeling of the game as a whole with the expansion included? Or do I try to isolate the expansion and rank them just based on the expansions themselves? And then there's the whole issue of standalone expansions. What do I do with a game that can be a game on its own, but also an expansion for a game? What do I do? What I ultimately decided to do was to make my life easier by actually making two videos. This video will focus on just expansions in and of themselves, and then I'm going to do another video with my top 10 standalone expansions, so I can kind of separate that out into a separate video, which will follow along sometime in the near future. So in this video, I'm going to talk about a few types of games that I've left off of my list for a couple of different reasons. I'm going to talk about some dishonorable mentions, then I'm going to get into my top 15 expansions, and finally I'm going to wrap up with a couple of games that I really wish had expansions for them. So let's begin by looking at some things that I have left off of the list. First of all, I've removed things that were replaced by an updated edition. For example, with the Council of Verona, there was the expansion Council of Verona Poison expansion, and it was a very tiny addition to the game, but what it added was pretty immense in terms of gameplay, so I wouldn't want to play without the expansion. But that being said, it was all wrapped up together in the second edition, so when I picked up the second edition of Council of Verona, it came with the Poison expansion included in the game. Another example is Viticulture, Tuscany, expand the world of viticulture. This could have easily been in the top 3 expansions on this list. However, it was kind of replaced by the essential editions that came out. I believe that's what's available now, and although I think Tuscany has its own essentials edition too, I'm not exactly sure how all that works. There's been a few different editions of viticulture along the way, and they've kind of changed things up a little bit and mixed and matched some things. So I've left off this one, even though it could have been near the top of this list. The other type of thing I've left off the list are games where expansions are kind of the whole purpose of the game. So one example, if I come back here, is all of my Warhammer Underworld stuff. Yeah, you can play with just the base game and the 2 factions that come with it, but there's a ton of other fun factions or warbands that come with the game, and a big part of the fun of the hobby of Warhammer Underworlds is collecting these other warbands, putting the figures together, painting them up, and then seeing how their abilities interact with the other warbands that are in the game. A second example would be my Wings of Glory World War I Rules and Accessory Pack here. Yes, the game box comes with all the basics you need to play the game, but then you want to get all kinds of fun aircraft to play out. And similar to Warhammer Underworlds, you want to see how the new aircraft stack up against the aircraft you have already. And the game is all about collecting these fun aircraft. Similarly, Wings of Glory, the Second World War version, and then of course later on we got things like X-Wing and the Star Wars stuff, and even I think some Star Trek stuff that was inspired by this system. And I mean, I just think World War I aircraft are gorgeous machines anyway, so it's fun to have them. But I've just chosen not to include games like that. I suppose collectible card games could also fall into the same category, where getting the boosters and the new content is all kind of a big part of the game. So that's why those things are off the list. Now, a couple of dishonorable mentions. There have been a couple of occasions, like I mentioned with Carcassonne, where the expansion has made the original game worse. Fortunately, I don't run into this very often, but I have a couple of examples here. Firstly, I've got Colt Express, which is a very simple and fun game of simultaneous programming and playing out a sequence of actions to see how your plans work out or not. The first expansion to this one, that was called Colt Express Horses and Stagecoach, was quite good. It added some fun things to the game. But then I found once I added the second expansion as well, which was called Marshal and Prisoners, it just added too many elements to what was originally a very simple, quick playing and fun game. It added just few too many things to keep track of and slowed down the gameplay a little bit too much. So I found that Marshals and Prisoners wasn't a great addition to Colt Express. Even more so, we have the first expansion for Isle of Skye, which I was so excited about because Isle of Skye is such a brilliant game. In a similar fashion to Colt Express, it is a very simple, approachable, quick-playing game. But then along came Isle of Skye Journeyman and took that simple game and just added all this crazy stuff to track. And to be honest with you, I bought the expansion, read the rule book, and said, there's no way I'm going to play Isle of Skye with all this stuff included, and I just sold it off without even playing it. But fortunately, another expansion came along, Isle of Skye Druids, and it looks like it does add some fun stuff, more along the lines of what I was originally hoping for. Although, once again, I haven't had a chance to play Druids yet, but it looks like it could be a fun addition to Isle of Skye. Alright, so now let's jump into the top 15 expansions. Before I do so, I just want to say a really quick thank you to my supporters. We have Tommy and we have Joanna on Patreon who give their support on a monthly basis. And we have another person, NQD, you know who you are. Thank you so much for your support as well. All of your generosity just really touches me, so thank you for that. And for anybody else who's interested in supporting me as well, check out my Patreon. Or you can maybe just buy me a nice Christmas coffee through another link that's in the description below here. And if not, totally cool. I'm just happy you're here. So here's the top 15 expansions. At number 15, we have Gloomhaven Forgotten Circles. Now, you might be looking at this and going, but Josh, your number one game of all time is Gloomhaven. How could the expansion be number 15? And this might be a good point to mention how I have ranked my 15 here, because I didn't do it earlier. Now, what I've done, instead of basically trying to rank the game as a whole with the expansion in it and go by that metric, what I've done here is I've ranked these things based on the amount the expansion adds to the game. The reason this puts Forgotten Circles so low is that it doesn't necessarily get integrated into the original base game per se, unless you really wanted to add the new character to the base game. Rather, what it gives you are 20 new scenarios, as well as some new monsters and items and this new character, to continue on the base game after you have finished up the original campaign. So as a result, it doesn't necessarily add a lot to the base game itself, but it adds some great things to do to continue on with this amazing game after you have completed the campaign, which I've done, as you would know if you've seen my other previous videos about it. So we have Gloomhaven Forgotten Circles at number 15. At number 14 is the expansions for Battles of Westeros. Now, there's a whole bunch of expansion content out there, and I've chosen the big box expansion, this thing's a beast, that is called Battles of Westeros House Baratheon Army Expansion, and I'm going to use this to represent the Battles of Westeros expansions. In a similar manner to Forgotten Circles, it doesn't necessarily add new things to mix in with the base game. Rather, it adds a bunch of new content that can be played after the base game is completed. You get a bunch of new army units added to the game, as well as new scenarios that utilize those army units. And that's really what all the expansions for Battles of Westeros are about, are for adding all these cool new units. In that way, it sort of walks the line that I was talking about earlier about the expansions being the whole point of the game, although this has more of a robust base game that doesn't really require expansions until you've really completed all the original scenarios. but it sure does add a lot of fun content to be played once you're finished with the base game stuff, which I never did get through the original base game campaign. But it's a game that I love. I think it's in my top 10. So that was number 14. Moving right along to 13 is Seven Wonders Duel Pantheon. I don't really enjoy the original Seven Wonders game, but I think very highly of Seven Wonders Duel. I think it's a really excellent two-player game. And what Pantheon does is it removes the forced card removal mechanism. So in the original base game, every single turn a player had to remove a card from the card pyramid. And what that meant was there were some fairly obvious choices at times. There were times when it felt like you were kind of forced along a certain path. However, with the addition of the gods and goddesses in the Pantheon, now instead of removing a card, you can use your turn to activate a god or a goddess, and then perhaps leave your opponents to take one of the available cards instead of yourself. That little difference makes a big difference in gameplay, and so that's why I have Seven Wonders Duel Pantheon at number 13. Another small two-player game comes up next at number 12, and that is Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small. I never really realized this as I was making the list, but this is very much along the same lines as Seven Wonders, in that I really don't like Agricola, the original board game, but I really enjoy this little two-player version of it. The expansions for this game have rather long names. They are Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small, More Buildings Big and Small, and then the other one is Even More Buildings Big and Small. Now, they are pretty much essential expansions because they don't add a lot to the game, but what they do add are pretty crucial for gameplay, because the base game itself has no random elements other than, I guess, what your opponent is doing. So in that way, the game is, in a sense, technically solvable. You could kind of work out the very best actions you could take and just play those every game. But the addition of the new buildings in both the expansions really shakes up the options for players and really helps to expand the strategic choices. So I wouldn't even recommend the base game on its own without the expansions, but with at least one or both of the expansions, this is a really super game. And that's why it's number 12 on my list. Moving along to 11, we're still sticking with the two-player theme here. We have a game called Hive, or in my case I have Hive Pocket Edition, which is just a smaller version of the excellent two-player, very chess-like game of Hive. The specific expansions I want to mention are the Mosquito, the Ladybug, and the Pillbug. These simple additions really add a lot to the game. Even though with each expansion you're only adding a single bug for each player, the differences in their movement, the way they play out in the game, definitely adds a lot to the gameplay of Hive. It's almost as if you're taking chess and introducing whole new pieces with different movement characteristics to the game of chess. I feel like there's a similar impact in the game of Hive here, and that's why it's at number 11. Now I'm going to tidy up a bit and we'll move on to number 10 here. Okay, diving into the top 10 now. This next expansion I'm going to mention, I need to add the caveat that I did help a little bit with the development and playtesting of this expansion. So I had a very, very small role in bringing this expansion to life. I thought I should mention that, but it is Clash of Cultures Civilizations. Clash of Cultures is my favorite Civ game, easily, and I've played a bunch of them, and there's just something about it that really hits all the right notes for me as a Civ game. Civilizations takes an already great game, and it adds a bunch of unique civs so that each player has kind of an asymmetrical starting layout, as well as adding new buildings, new units, cavalry, and the all-important elephants, and pirates, and all kinds of fun stuff. So I just really love that it takes the base game where players all started off exactly the same, for all intents and purposes were the same civilization at the beginning of the game, and it differentiates the players now so that you can feel like you're playing a unique civ. Each of those unique civs has its leaders from actual history, and it just helps players get into the role that they've taken on as a civilization for the game. So that's why number 10 is Clash of Cultures Civilizations. Number 9 is 2 expansions, and we have Steam Torpedo First Contact as the base game, and to that we add an expansion called R&D and another one called To Your Positions. Steam Torpedo, yet again, is a very tactical 2-player game where you're building a sub out of room tiles, putting your crew in there, and using your crew to activate your sub and trying to sink the opponent's sub. What the expansions add are new room tiles and new crew members. The room tiles in particular really are important for the game because all of a sudden you can take a game where you had either a predetermined setup or a random setup with the same tiles every time, and you can just add a bunch of new tiles to the mix and then start with a draft where you can really customize your sub and personalize it and then see how it ends up playing out during the battle. So this adds some really important stuff to the setup of the game, and sort of like with Clash of Culture Civilizations, gives you a unique starting point. Although, to be fair, both subs were different in the original game too, so there was an asymmetrical element of the game to begin with. This just allows you to personalize it more. So that's why we have the Steam Torpedo expansions at number 9. At number 8 is a gigantic box. Let's see how this works. And it could be argued that the base game that I'm about to mention here is already huge enough and monstrous and involving and complicated. It doesn't need, the last thing it needs is more expansions. But it's such a good game, which is why I have the expansions for War of the Ring here at number 8. So we have Warriors of Middle-earth. Along with that are Lords of Middle-earth and the upcoming Kings of Middle-earth. And these just add all kinds of new characters from the Tolkien lore, new factions and army units, just more of the rich lore of Tolkien that at the same time expands the strategic options for players by giving them maybe various heroes and characters to focus on to maybe activate certain things and maybe take players out of the kind of strategic ruts that they might fall into after several plays. In any case, more Lord of the Rings stuff is good with me. I just love what they add to the base game. And that's why it's all at number 8. Number 7 is another game of warfare called 878 Vikings Invasions of England, and the expansion is called the Viking Age Expansion. What's particularly cool about the Viking Age expansion is that it adds 9 different modules that you can substitute in or out of the game depending on how you want your game to feel. So I guess you could throw all 9 of the modules into the game and really add a whole bunch of new stuff to it, or you could just add 1 or 2 and just switch things up a little bit. But in any case, you get all sorts of fun things like forts and ships and legendary leaders and all kinds of great stuff. Now, I'll be honest and say this is one of the few games that I own that I still haven't had a chance to play yet, so I haven't even gotten to the base game yet, let alone all the expansion content. But it all looks so cool, and I wish I had somebody to play it with. Anyway, that all is my number 7. Going on to number 6. From Vikings, we go to pirates, and my very favorite pirate game, which is Merchants and Marauders. The expansion for Merchants and Marauders is Seas of Glory. And very much along the same lines as 878 Vikings, it adds 11 new modules and 5 new variants, running the gamut from weather effects to crew morale to a treasure galleon and just all kinds of cool stuff. Much in the same manner as War of the Ring, it could be argued that the base game of Merchants and Marauders already has a ton going on and a lot of stuff to keep track of. Although that didn't stop me from creating a couple of fan-made expansions that I called Ports and Forts and... yeah, Ports and Forts, I think it was. But anyways, I don't need to use my fan-made expansion anymore because we have new towns that are added to the game and all kinds of other great stuff. I've played a bunch of the base game, but since purchasing the expansion, haven't had a chance to play the game yet. I'd sure love to see how they change up the game. Anyways, that is my number 5, Merchants and Marauders. And let me put these games away and get... sorry, that was my number 6, Merchants and Marauders. Let me clear those up and then we'll get into the top 5. Alright, my top 5 expansions here include a couple of games that I recently sold, so I no longer own them, but I'm so enthralled by the expansions that I really felt like I had to include them in my list still. Now, my number 5 is a game that I do own still, although it's been so many years since I've got to play it, and I love this game. And we have Chaos in the Old World with the Horned Rat expansion. I would argue that the Chaos in the Old World base game is strictly a 4-player game because the 4 factions are so balanced against each other and really need each other to keep that balance. And the Horned Rat expansion adds a 5th faction that turns it from a strictly 4-player game into a strictly 5-player game. It also adds new Old World cards, and very importantly, it adds new Chaos cards that create all new strategies for the base game races. With the original races, it was pretty clear what strategic path you needed to take to achieve either a dial victory or a victory point condition victory, and each of the factions were geared more towards one than the other, but the new Chaos cards mix that up and allow factions that were once maybe strictly a dial victory faction to maybe go for victory points and see if that works out. So it really opens up the strategic space of the game. And I so miss playing this game. At one point I was really hoping to start a Chaos Club where I could find 4 other gamers and just make a regular event of it where maybe every couple of weeks we would play a game of Chaos in the Old World and really get to know our factions well so that we could really play as experienced and knowledgeable players and really get to know the game. But alas, I don't really have any gaming friends anymore, so that is not likely to happen in the foreseeable future. But Chaos in the Old World with the Horned Rat expansion is my number 5. Number 4 is a big cooperative game called Spirit Island. And we have a couple of expansions with Spirit Island. We have Branch and Claw as well as Jagged Earth that add a bunch of new spirits as well as a bunch of new tokens for beasts, wilds, strife, and disease. We have an event deck and new feared cards and blight cards and new scenarios and just all kinds of great stuff that is added to Spirit Island. One of the coolest things about this game is the fact that each spirit plays so differently and is so asymmetrical from the other ones. And so each time you add a new spirit to the game, you really have to explore it and discover its play style and how it really plays to its strengths and weaknesses. These big changes are why Spirit Island is number 4 on the list. Number 3 is one of those games that I recently sold. And again, I have to caveat that this is the first game that I was actually involved with in the development and playtesting, and I was a huge fan of this game for a long time. In fact, it was my number 1 ranked game for many years, going back to when, in fact, well, hold on, I should tell you what I'm talking about. The game is called Attack, and the expansion is the Attack Deluxe expansion. Now, this is the game that got me back into hobby board gaming back in about 2003, because I remembered my childhood love of playing a game called Shogun, which is also called Samurai Swords, which is more recently called Yakuza, and that game really had a ton of fond memories for me. And so when I was older, I saw a game of Axis and Allies in a mall and thought, I'd really like to get a game like that again. And I went to a game store, and instead of Axis and Allies, I ended up getting Attack, which is very Axis and Allies-like, although it's probably a little bit lighter than A&A. And so I picked up this game, and for a while, 4X games, I guess, were my favorite type of game. Which is funny, because now I don't even really enjoy that style of game anymore. I've really only kept Nexus Ops because it's very simple and fast playing. But the Attack Deluxe expansion had a huge impact in the game. It took it from being a very Risk, Axis and Allies-like standard game of soldiers on a map to a game that was, I felt, a lot more strategic, a little bit Euro-influenced even. It added new action cards, a new technology development system, a victory point system, 3 lengths of gameplay, and a whole new naval combat system, which was really cool too. So all the stuff that the Attack Deluxe expansion added were so different and so much more interesting than the original Attack expansion was. So that's why, even though I don't own it anymore, I thought I'd include it as number 3 here. So far we've seen my number 1 ranked game of all time, Gloomhaven. We've seen my number 2 ranked game of all time, War of the Ring. Now we have what is my number 3 ranked game of all time. That is Mr. Jack with the Mr. Jack extension. The original Mr. Jack had a standard setup and a game that at least started out the same every time. What the extension adds are 5 new characters that can be substituted with one or more of the original 8 characters, and each of the new 5 characters obviously has their own unique abilities. And then we also have a player-controlled setup. So much like with Steam Torpedo, where you are adding a very tactical element to the setup of the game, the Mr. Jack extension adds a whole setup phase that is pretty crucial to how the rest of the game plays out. So it really switches up the base Mr. Jack game and takes it to a nearly infinite gameplay in terms of the setup and the new characters that can be switched in and out and that sort of thing. So Mr. Jack extension really adds a lot to the Mr. Jack base game, which is why it's number 2. My number 1 is another game that I recently sold, and it is an expansion called Deus Egypt. This, for me, is the best expansion in board gaming because in the original game of Deus, there were 6 types of cards that you could acquire for your civilization. Deus Egypt also has the same 6 types of cards, but they're totally different cards that can be swapped out with the original game cards, either singly or in multiples, so that maybe you could just swap out a single card type and change the game a little bit, or you could swap out all 6 card types and make it a very different game. And yet at its core it still feels very much the same. So it doesn't completely change the game, but it makes it different in a familiar way, if that makes sense. So for me, Deus Egypt is the number 1 expansion of all time. Now, before we wrap up, I'm going to mention a couple that I wish existed. This first one was on Kickstarter and failed to fund, which just broke my heart. And this is an expansion for Kings of Air in Steam that was called World's Fair. The original Kings of Air in Steam is an excellent game built around the pick up and deliver mechanism with a fun economy built into it. And it's a game I've played a lot, to the point where it was starting to feel a little bit stale that we had played it so much. It was really needing something else to spice it up, which is why I was so excited to hear that World's Fair was going to come along and add some new teams and ships, as well as new technologies and who knows what else, that would have really breathed new life into a game that had, like I said, become a little bit stale. I hope that someday, somehow, this comes to life and I can get even more enjoyment out of Kings of Air and Steam. But for now, I have to make do with the base game. The other one does have an expansion coming for it, but it's not the type of expansion I was hoping for. The base game is Hunt for the Ring, and there is an expansion coming out called Light and Shadow that will introduce 4 new characters from the initial chapters of the Lord of the Rings into the game. What I was hoping it would add is unique abilities for each of the Nazgul, because this is a one versus many game where the one player plays Frodo and Gandalf and tries to sneak around while the 4 Nazgul players try to hunt down that player. Now the problem is playing each of the Nazgul is the same, so there's nothing to differentiate them other than you can possibly get the Witch King into play, which adds a little bit of a different element to it. But I really wanted them to add something to make each Nazgul player feel like they're doing their own thing and aren't all just kind of doing the same thing, I guess. I will say, from the point of view of the Nazgul players, that this game probably has the best hunting mechanism of all of these one versus many secret movement type of games. It is really clever how you can sort of narrow down the location of the Fellowship player that you're searching for. But it'll be interesting to see what they do come up with the Light and Shadow expansion. Now, how about you? What are some of your very favorite expansions that took a game and really turned it up to 11? What are some games that you wish had an expansion? Please do let me know in the comments. Holy cow, you made it to the end of this video. That really does mean a lot to me. The other thing that means a lot to me is if you would give it a thumb up or subscribe to my channel, or maybe share this video with one person that you think would enjoy it. Cheers. So pretty much anything is pretty much a 10 out of a 10. 10 out of a 10. First of all, when you add more stuff, what, or do I try to expansions? So let's begin with a couple that I left off of it came with the poison extend. So it's similar. Anyhow, what? Hello.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Just interrupt you in the YouTube video.
Yeah, that's okay, bud. What do you want?
I just came to say hi.
Dudes on a map type of, with other original. The original Kings of Air and Steam is a very great pick. I hope someday, somehow, it sees the life. Where is it? Oh.